The transport ship shook as it passed through the energy field surrounding the Galactic Defense Academy. Hana Kim pressed her face against the small window and watched the massive structure grow larger before her eyes. The academy looked like a giant crystal floating in space between three bright suns. Its walls glowed with soft blue light that pulsed like a heartbeat. She was the first human ever accepted into this place. The letter had arrived at her home on Earth 6 months ago, written in symbols she could barely read. Her government had celebrated. The news channels had called her a hero before she even left the planet. But now, sitting alone in the transport, Hana felt very small. The docking bay was enormous. Ships from dozens of different worlds sat in neat rows, their designs as alien as their owners. Hana gathered her single bag and walked down the ramp. The gravity felt different here, lighter than Earth but heavier than the transport. The air tasted strange, like metal and flowers mixed together. Other new students moved through the bay in groups. Hana stared at them with wide eyes. She had seen pictures of alien species before, but seeing them in person was different. The Velthrons walked on 2 legs like humans, but they were much taller and covered in purple armor that looked like it grew from their skin. Their faces were angular and sharp, with eyes that glowed yellow in the strange light. The Krell moved differently. They had 4 arms and skin that looked like green metal. Their heads were shaped like triangles with huge eyes that seemed to see everything at once. When they walked, their feet clicked against the floor like insects. But the strangest were the Netheri. They looked like smoke that had learned to walk upright. Sometimes they were solid, sometimes they became see-through. Hana watched one of them walk straight through a wall and come out the other side. A voice spoke in the air around them. The words came in dozens of languages at once, but somehow Hana understood them perfectly. New students report to Orientation Hall 7. Follow the blue lights. Blue lights appeared in the floor, forming a path through the station. Hana followed them with the other students, trying not to stare too much. The corridors were wide and curved, with walls that seemed to be alive. They moved slowly, like breathing, and the light inside them shifted from blue to green to purple. Orientation Hall 7 was bigger than any building Hana had ever seen. Thousands of students sat in rows that went up so high she could not see the ceiling. Most of them were talking in languages that sounded like music or metal or wind. A few looked at her as she found an empty seat. Their expressions were hard to read on faces so different from human ones. At the front of the hall, a figure appeared. It was not solid like the students, but made of light that shifted and changed colors. When it spoke, its voice came from everywhere at once. Welcome to the Galactic Defense Academy. You are here because your species has chosen you to represent them among the stars. For the next 3 years, you will train to become protectors of galactic peace. The light being gestured, and images appeared in the air above the students. They showed space battles, alien worlds, and technology beyond human understanding. Each of you brings unique abilities to this academy. The Velthrons bring strength and natural armor. The Krell bring speed and precision. The Netheri bring the power to move between dimensions. Together you will learn to use these gifts in service of all free peoples. Hana looked around at her fellow students. They sat up straighter when their species was mentioned, pride clear on their alien faces. She waited for humans to be mentioned, but the light being moved on to other topics. Your first classes begin tomorrow. Combat training is mandatory for all students. You will be ranked based on your performance. Those who excel will join the elite units. Those who struggle will find other ways to serve. After the orientation, students moved toward their dormitories. Hana found herself walking alone through corridors filled with groups of aliens who already seemed to know each other. Her room was small and simple, with a bed, a desk, and a window that looked out into space. She unpacked her few belongings and sat on the bed. For the first time since leaving Earth, she let herself feel scared. Everyone else here was bigger, stronger, or had special powers. What did humans have that could compare to armor-plated skin or the ability to walk through walls? The next morning, Hana woke to the sound of chimes that seemed to come from the walls themselves. She dressed in the training clothes that had been left in her room and followed other students to the combat training center. The training center was a huge room with a floor that felt soft under her feet. Strange machines lined the walls and the ceiling showed images of space battles. An instructor waited for them at the center of the room. He was Velthron, tall and purple with scars across his armored skin. I am Commander Yemin, he said in a voice like grinding stone. I will teach you to fight. Some of you will learn quickly. Others will learn slowly. A few will not learn at all. His yellow eyes found Hana in the group of students. Today we begin with simple combat exercises. You will be paired with students of similar size and experience. Hana found herself facing Deho, a young Veltron who was twice her height and 3 times her weight. His purple armor gleamed under the training center lights. He looked down at her with what might have been amusement. "This should not take long," he said. The instructor gave the signal to begin. Deho moved forward with casual confidence, one armored hand reaching out to simply grab Hana and end the match. She tried to duck under his reach, but he was faster than she expected. His hand closed around her arm and lifted her off the ground. The match lasted exactly 4 minutes. Deho was not cruel, but he was Veltron. His people had evolved on a world where only the strong survived. Fighting was as natural to him as breathing. When he finally put Hana down, she could barely stand. The medical scanner in the training center beeped as it examined her. 3 cracked ribs and a concussion that would have kept most species in bed for weeks. But Hana was human, and humans were stubborn in ways the galaxy had never seen. 6 hours later, she walked out of the medical bay and signed up for another training session. The other students watched with confusion as she entered her name on the list for the next day. Losing was supposed to teach lessons about knowing your place. But Hana had learned a different lesson entirely. She had learned that Deho dropped his guard after landing what he thought was a finishing blow. She had learned that Velthron armor made clicking sounds when it shifted weight. She had learned that even apex predators had patterns they followed without thinking. Most importantly, she had learned that losing was just another form of education, and humans were very good students. The next morning, Hana walked back into the combat training center with the same steady step she had used the day before. Behind her, alien students began to whisper in their strange languages. They were starting to realize that the small human did not understand the most basic rule of galactic society. She did not know when to quit. 3 months had passed since Hana first walked into the combat training center. The academy kept careful records of every match, and her name had found its permanent place at the bottom of every ranking list. Above her stretched an impressive collection of alien superiority that seemed designed to remind her exactly where humans belonged in the galactic order. Jinwoo held the top position with the confidence that came naturally to his species. The Krell warrior moved through combat exercises like a living weapon, his forearms striking from angles that human anatomy could never achieve. His chitinous skin deflected training weapons that would have seriously injured softer species. When he fought, his compound eyes tracked multiple opponents at once, processing movement faster than human thoughts could form. Below him, Minji occupied second place through abilities that seemed to break the basic rules of physics. The Netheri could become gas when attacks came toward her, then solidify at the perfect moment to strike back. Watching her fight was like watching smoke learn to punch. She had never been hit in any training exercise simply because hitting smoke was impossible. The rest of the rankings filled with creatures whose very existence felt like cheating. Subin could manipulate gravity with his thoughts, making opponents too heavy to move or too light to maintain balance. Hieri could absorb energy from electrical attacks and redirect it back at her enemies. Young-Ho could change his shape into any form he needed, becoming a living sword or a shield made of flesh. Every week, new rankings were posted on the academy walls. Every week, Hana looked at her name at the bottom and signed up for more training sessions. The other students had started watching her matches not because they were exciting, but because they were puzzling. Most beings learn to avoid pain. Hana seemed to collect it like other students collected victories. Her technique was improving, though the improvements were hard to see in the final results. She had learned to read Velthron body language, recognizing the subtle shifts in posture that came before their powerful attacks. She could predict Krell strike patterns by watching the way their compound eyes focused. She had even figured out the energy fluctuations that happened when Netheri prepared to phase through matter. But knowing what was coming and being fast enough to stop it were 2 different things. Hana could see Jinwoo preparing to strike from 3 different angles at once, but human reflexes were simply too slow to block attacks that moved faster than her nervous system could process. She could predict when Minji would solidify, but human speed could not match the split-second timing needed to land a hit. The Academy Medical Bay had become her second home. The automated healing systems worked well on human biology, though they often seemed confused by how quickly she returned for more treatment. Most species needed days or weeks to recover from serious training injuries. Hana was usually back in the combat center within hours. Commander Jamin, the Velthron instructor, had stopped offering advice after the first month. His species valued strength above all else, and strength was something Hana clearly lacked. But he continued to watch her matches with the careful attention of someone trying to solve a puzzle that made no sense. Other instructors had begun visiting the training center during Hana's sessions. They stood in small groups, speaking in their alien languages while watching the small human lose fight after fight. Their expressions were hard to read, but their interest was obvious. Something about her pattern of defeat was drawing attention from across the academy. Hana herself had started to understand what she was really learning. Each loss taught her something new about how different species fought when they were confident of victory. She was building a detailed map of alien combat psychology, learning how warriors behaved when they believed their superiority was guaranteed. Velthrons fought with the casual arrogance of a species that had never met their match. They relied on strength and armor, but they also relied on their opponents being intimidated by that strength. When fighting someone they knew they could defeat easily, they became sloppy, leaving openings that a more serious opponent would never see. Krell fought with mathematical precision, but their calculations assumed normal reaction times from their opponents. They expected enemies to respond within predictable time frames. A human who moved slightly faster or slower than their algorithms expected could create moments of confusion. In their perfect systems, even the untouchable Netheri had weaknesses hidden in their incredible abilities. They needed to become completely solid for a full second when delivering powerful attacks. They also followed energy conservation patterns, using more gas form during long fights to avoid exhaustion. Every alien species carried the genetic memory of being apex predators on their home worlds. They fought like creatures that had never needed to fear anything, because fear was something that happened to other species. But Hana was learning that confidence could be turned into a weapon against those who possessed it. She started taking longer to lose her matches. Fights that had ended in minutes now lasted 10 or 15 minutes. She began landing hits on opponents who had never been touched by weaker species. Nothing that caused serious damage, but enough to make them work harder for their inevitable victories. The Academy betting pools, managed by species whose mathematics included probability calculations beyond human understanding, began showing strange fluctuations. While Hana never won, her matches were becoming harder to predict. Fights that should have ended quickly were lasting longer than the statistical models suggested possible. Students from other species started approaching her between training sessions. Not to offer friendship exactly, but to ask questions about human physiology and psychology. They were beginning to realize that understanding their opponents was more complicated than they had assumed. Su-hyun, a female Velthron whose purple armor bore the ritual scars of her warrior caste, was the first to offer direct help. She began showing Hana weak points in Velthron anatomy that even most Velthrons did not know about. Pressure points hidden beneath armor plates. Joints that could be manipulated if approached from unexpected angles. Kyong, a young Krell who had initially dismissed Hana as amusing but irrelevant, started sharing information about his species' reflexive patterns. He was curious about how human minds processed combat information, and his scientific approach to fighting had revealed details about Krell psychology that Hana could use. But the help came with an underlying assumption that never changed. They were teaching her to lose more gracefully, not to win. The idea that a human might actually defeat one of them in serious combat was so far outside their understanding that they could not even consider it as a possibility. Hana accepted their help with the same steady determination she brought to everything else. She listened carefully to their advice and applied it in her next matches. She continued to lose, but now she was losing while teaching herself to fight like someone who belonged in their academy. The watching instructors made notes in their private files. The small human was becoming something unprecedented in galactic military history. She was becoming dangerous precisely because everyone assumed she was harmless. Month 6 brought news that made every student in the academy nervous. The midterm combat evaluations would determine who advanced to specialized training programs and who got reassigned to support roles in the galactic fleet. For most alien species, this represented a manageable challenge they had been preparing for their entire lives. For Hana, it was a test she had no chance of passing by normal standards. The evaluation rules were simple and brutal. Each student would fight 10 consecutive matches against randomly selected opponents. No rest periods between fights. No medical treatment until all 10 matches were complete. Students needed to win at least 6 matches to advance. Those who failed would spend the rest of their academy years learning to repair ships and operate communication systems. Hana looked at the announcement posted on the crystal walls of the dormitory corridor. Around her, other students discussed their strategies with the confidence of beings who had been winning fights since they could walk. Even the weakest students in her class had win rates above 60%. Hana had never won a single match. The night before evaluations began, she sat in her small room looking out at the 3 suns that lit the academy. She had learned more about combat in 6 months than most humans learned in their entire lives. She could read alien body language, predict attack patterns, and exploit weaknesses that their own species did not know they possessed. But learning and winning were still 2 different things. Her first evaluation match was against Yunji, a Nethiri whose phasing abilities had made her effectively unbeatable against conventional attacks. The alien fighter floated into the combat chamber with the relaxed confidence of someone who had never faced a serious challenge. Her gaseous form shimmered in the artificial light, occasionally becoming solid enough to show her true shape before dissolving back into smoke. The match began with Hana charging straight forward, exactly as she had done in hundreds of previous fights. It was a move that any competent fighter could easily counter, and Yunji responded exactly as expected. She phased through the attack and began to solidify behind Hana for the finishing blow. But this time something was different. Hana was already moving before Yunji completed her materialization. 6 months of careful observation had taught her to recognize the subtle energy fluctuations that preceded Nethiri solidification. She spun with timing that looked impossible, landing a solid strike just as Yunji became vulnerable. The alien fighter staggered, her gaseous form flickering as shock disrupted her matter control systems. For the first time in her life, a Nethiri had been hit by a supposedly inferior opponent. The watching instructors leaned forward in their observation booth, their alien faces showing expressions of surprise. What followed was unlike any combat the Academy had recorded in its 3-century history. Yunji, forced to fight an opponent who could predict her phasing, found herself trapped in solid form more often than her physiology preferred. Hana pressed this advantage with relentless human determination, using endurance that gradually exhausted her opponent's energy reserves. The match lasted 17 minutes. Hana eventually lost when Yunji managed a desperate phase strike combination that caught her off guard, but the damage was done. A human had landed multiple hits on an untouchable opponent and forced her to work harder than she had ever worked before. 9 more matches followed. Hana lost every single one, just as the statistical predictions had calculated, but each defeat came at a cost her opponents had not expected to pay. She forced Velthrons to use their full strength instead of casual superiority. She made Krell warriors sweat acidic perspiration as they struggled to end fights that should have been simple. She pushed energy beings to drain their reserves fighting an opponent who refused to acknowledge their obvious superiority. By the final match, her Veltron opponent was breathing heavily despite his species' superior cardiovascular system. His purple armor showed stress fractures from impacts that should have been too weak to cause damage. When the match ended with his victory, he looked at Hana with something approaching respect. The evaluation results were posted that evening. Hana's name appeared exactly where everyone expected it, at the bottom of the failure list. 0 wins out of 10 matches. But beside the official results, unofficial conversations began spreading through the academy dormitories. Students who had watched the evaluations were describing something that challenged their understanding of what defeat actually meant. The human had lost every fight, but she had also accomplished something none of them had ever seen. She had made superior opponents struggle against someone they should have been able to defeat without effort. Soo-yun found Hana in the academy cafeteria the next morning, sitting alone at a table designed for species much larger than humans. The Veltran warrior sat down across from her, her purple armor creating small stress marks in the metal chair. "I watched your evaluation matches," she said in the careful standard galactic that all academy students were required to learn. "Your performance was unusual." Hana looked up from her meal, which the food dispensers had configured for human dietary requirements. "I lost all 10 matches. There was nothing unusual about that." "You made Yunji work for 17 minutes, Soo-yun replied. Most opponents last less than 3 minutes against Netheri phase fighters. You force Taekwon to use combat stimulants during his match. Veltrans are not supposed to need chemical enhancement against weaker species. Other students at nearby tables had begun listening to their conversation. Discussions about the humans' evaluation performance had been happening in dormitories and training centers since the results were announced. Everyone had opinions about what they had witnessed. "You fight like someone who expects to lose," said Kyung, the young Krell who had joined their table without invitation, his compound eyes fixed on Hana with the mathematical precision his species used to analyze everything. "But you also fight like someone who has plans for what happens after losing." Hana considered this observation while finishing her meal. It was an accurate description of her approach, though she had never thought about it in those terms. Losing had become a tool she used to gather information and test theories about alien psychology. Every defeat taught her something new about how different species responded to unexpected challenges. "My species does not give up easily," she said finally, "even when we probably should." The conversation continued for another hour, drawing more students who wanted to understand what they had witnessed during the evaluations. None of them could explain how someone who lost every fight had somehow impressed experienced instructors and made superior opponents work harder than they ever had. Before Commander Jamin appeared at their table as the group was preparing to leave for afternoon classes, the Veltron instructor looked down at Hana with eyes that held a mixture of confusion and something that might have been approval. "You will continue with standard training programs," he announced, in his voice like grinding stone. "Your evaluation scores do not qualify you for advanced combat specialization." He paused, studying her face for reactions that her alien features made difficult to interpret. "However, your matches have been selected for detailed analysis by the Academy Tactical Department. Your methods of extending combat duration against superior opponents may have applications in defensive warfare scenarios." Hana nodded politely, though she was not entirely sure what the announcement meant for her future at the academy. The instructor continued to stare at her for several seconds before turning to address the other students at the table. "All of you performed within expected parameters for your species. You will advance to specialized training programs appropriate to your natural abilities." After he left, the group sat in silence for several minutes. They were advancing to the academy's elite programs while the human who had impressed them all was being left behind in basic training. But somehow none of them felt like they had achieved something more significant than what Hana had accomplished with her perfect record of defeat. That evening, Hana walked through the academy corridors with the same steady pace she had maintained since her first day. Behind her, conversations continued, in a dozen different languages, about the human who had turned losing into an art form so sophisticated that it was beginning to look like strategy. In the academy's tactical analysis department, senior instructors began studying combat footage that challenged their fundamental assumptions about warfare. They were watching someone who had discovered that defeat could be weaponized by those who understood it better than victory. The advanced combat program divided students into specialized tracks based on their species' natural advantages. Veltrans learned heavy assault tactics that turned their armored bodies into living weapons. Krell studied rapid strike techniques that exploited reflexes faster than most beings could perceive. Netheri practiced infiltration methods that used their phasing abilities to bypass any defense. Hana found herself assigned to the adaptive combat track, a program that Academy records showed had been created for species with no clear physical superiority. It was the place where beings who could not match the galaxy's apex predators learned to find whatever small advantages they possessed and use them wisely. The adaptive track classrooms were smaller than the main training centers, with equipment that looked older and less advanced. The instructors were mostly beings from minor species whose own military careers had been limited by similar physical constraints. They approached their duties with the quiet professionalism of those who understood what it meant to be permanently. Second-best instructor Minsu was a Caloran whose gray skin and 6 arms made him look like a cross between a tree and an octopus. His species was known for their patience and analytical thinking, traits that had served them well in support roles throughout galactic history. He looked at his new class of misfits with eyes that had seen decades of students who would never be heroes. "Welcome to adaptive combat training," he said, in a voice that sounded like wind through leaves. You are here because the galaxy has decided that your species are not naturally suited for frontline warfare. This program will teach you to find ways to contribute to galactic defense despite your limitations. The other students in the class were a collection of beings whose evolutionary paths had not produced obvious military advantages. There was Cheung from the Relentless species, whose people were known for their ability to communicate with machines, but had no combat enhancements. Donghae represented the Vorthak, a species of natural healers whose pacifist culture had never developed warrior traditions. Most of them accepted their placement in the adaptive track with resigned understanding. They would learn to operate advanced weapon systems, coordinate supply lines, and provide technical support for the real warriors. It was honorable work that kept the galaxy's military functioning, even if it would never earn them glory or recognition. Hana approached the program with different intentions. While her classmates focused on finding their one exploitable advantage, she began studying everything the Academy had to offer. She requested access to medical databases that contained detailed information about every major species anatomy. She spent hours in the historical archives, reviewing combat footage from actual galactic conflicts. What she discovered challenged everything the Academy's sanitized training simulations had taught her. The archive footage showed that even the galaxy's most feared warriors had weaknesses when pushed beyond their comfort zones. Veltrons who relied too heavily on their armor became slow and predictable. Krell, whose mathematical precision failed them in chaotic situations, often froze rather than adapt. Nithiri, who exhausted their energy reserves, were forced to remain solid, becoming vulnerable to attacks they normally could phase through. Hana began developing techniques that exploited these hidden vulnerabilities. She learned to use her smaller size to get inside the effective range of larger opponents' attacks, making their strength advantages irrelevant. Her human flexibility, useless against armored opponents in direct confrontation, became devastating when applied to joint manipulation and pressure point attacks that alien anatomy textbooks never considered worth protecting. Most importantly, she discovered that her human endurance was not just physical, but psychological. While alien species fought with the confidence of genetic superiority, they became confused and ineffective when that superiority was challenged. A Krell who missed his first 3 attacks would begin to doubt his reflexes, causing his legendary speed to degrade as stress chemicals flooded his system. A Netheri who faced an opponent who could predict her phasing would lose the mental composure necessary for precise matter manipulation. Her adaptive track. Classmates watched with growing amazement as Hana turned their shared inadequacy into a comprehensive education in galactic warfare. She shared her discoveries freely, teaching Cheung how to use machine communication abilities to disrupt opponents' electronic equipment. She showed Donghae how healing knowledge could be reversed to identify exactly where to strike for maximum effectiveness. Instructor Minsu noticed the changes in his classroom dynamics. Students who had entered the program expecting to learn limitations were instead learning to think creatively about overcoming them. The human had somehow transformed adaptive combat training from an exercise in accepting defeat into a masterclass in turning disadvantages into weapons. Your approach is unconventional, he told Hana after a particularly innovative training session, where she had taught the class to use environmental factors as force multipliers. Most students in this program focus on avoiding direct confrontation with superior opponents. Hana was practicing a technique that used an opponent's momentum against them, turning a Veltron's armored charge into a self-defeating attack. Avoiding confrontation is not always possible. Sometimes you have to fight opponents who are stronger, faster, and better equipped than you are. And you believe these techniques would work against real opponents in actual combat? I believe that every species has weaknesses they do not know about, Hana replied. The Academy training simulations are designed to showcase natural advantages. They do not test what happens when those advantages are challenged in unexpected ways. Minsu considered this observation while watching her demonstrate a technique that used human agility to attack joints that were protected by armor but vulnerable to precise application of force from unexpected angles. The logic was sound, but it required a level of detailed knowledge about alien anatomy that most warriors never bothered to acquire. You study our opponents more thoroughly than most. Students study their own species, he noted. My species learns by making mistakes, Hana said. But we also learn from other people's mistakes. Every combat recording in your archives shows me something about how different species fight when they are confident, and how they react when that confidence is challenged. The Academy's combat simulators began registering anomalous results from the adaptive track training sessions. Students who should have been learning to accept their limitations were instead extending simulated combat scenarios far beyond normal parameters. Fights that should have ended quickly were lasting 20 or 30 minutes, with the weaker combatants refusing to be defeated within expected timeframes. Senior instructors started visiting the adaptive track classrooms to observe these extended simulations. They watched students use environmental factors, psychological manipulation, and detailed anatomical knowledge to challenge opponents who possessed every natural advantage. The techniques were unconventional and required extensive preparation, but they were also undeniably effective. Word of the adaptive track's unusual training methods began spreading through the Academy's advanced programs. Students from the elite track started requesting permission to observe sessions where supposedly inferior beings were learning to fight like they had chances of winning. Jinwoo, the Krell champion who held the Academy's top combat ranking, appeared at one of Hana's training sessions without announcement. He watched silently as she demonstrated techniques for disrupting Krell reflexive patterns by attacking from angles that their compound eyes could not track effectively. "This is not how combat works," he said after the demonstration ended. "Superior beings defeat inferior beings. This is the natural order of the galaxy." Hana looked at him with the same steady gaze she brought to everything else. Natural order assumes that everyone follows the same rules. What happens when someone refuses to follow those rules? They lose, Jinwoo replied with the certainty of someone who had never been seriously challenged. "But what if they lose while teaching you that your rules have weaknesses you never knew about?" Hana asked. "What if they lose in ways that make you work harder than you have ever worked before? What if they lose while making you doubt whether your superiority is as absolute as you thought?" The Krell warrior had no answer for questions that challenged the fundamental assumptions underlying his worldview. He left the training session without speaking again, but his compound eyes showed the first hints of doubt that any student had ever seen in them. That evening, Hana walked through the Academy corridors carrying data tablets filled with anatomical studies and combat analysis. Behind her, conversations were beginning in a dozen different languages about the adaptive track student who was teaching everyone to question what they thought they knew about warfare. In the Academy's advanced tactical department, senior officers were discovering that their most interesting combat simulations were no longer coming from the elite students they had always focused on. They were coming from the adaptive track, where supposedly inferior beings were learning to wage war against the natural order of the galaxy itself. Year-end combat trials arrived with all the ceremony that 3 centuries of galactic tradition could provide. The Academy's main arena had been transformed into an amphitheater that could hold representatives from every major species in the galaxy. Diplomatic observers, military leaders, and recruitment officials filled the crystalline seats, their alien forms creating a rainbow of colors and shapes under the artificial lighting. The tournament bracket appeared on massive displays throughout the Academy, showing the expected hierarchy that everyone had come to accept as natural law. At the top, Jinwoo held the first seed with a combat record that had never included a loss lasting longer than 90 seconds. His Krell physiology and mathematical combat precision had made him untouchable throughout his Academy career. Below him, the greatest fighters from each major species prepared for battles that would determine their futures among the stars. Minji, the Netheri phaser, occupied the second seed through abilities that seemed to violate basic physics. Tae-hoon, a gravity manipulator whose thoughts could crush opponents, held third place. The rankings continued down through beings whose evolutionary advantages read like a catalog of cosmic unfairness. At the bottom of the bracket, in the position traditionally reserved for ceremonial first-round eliminations, Hana's name appeared in standard galactic script. The Academy's betting systems, operated by species whose mathematics could calculate probability across multiple dimensions, had determined her odds of advancing past the first round at levels so low they barely registered as mathematical possibilities. But the betting systems had been designed to analyze normal patterns of combat between beings who followed the established rules of galactic warfare. They could not account for what 18 months of systematic defeat had created in the small human who walked steadily through the Academy. Corridors. Hana had lost over 400 consecutive matches during her time at the academy. Each loss had been a detailed lesson in how different species fought when they assumed victory was guaranteed. She knew every major warrior's preferred attack patterns, their recovery times between strikes, their psychological responses when confidence began to crack under unexpected pressure. Her first tournament opponent was Minho, a young Velthran whose purple armor had been polished to mirror brightness for the ceremonial matches. He approached their fight with the casual confidence that came naturally to a species that had never met their evolutionary match. The audience of diplomatic observers settled back in their seats, expecting to witness a brief demonstration of Velthran's superiority before moving on to more competitive matches. The fight began with Minho's traditional power assault, a straightforward demonstration of armored strength designed to end conflicts before they could develop into actual contests. His species had used this approach successfully for millennia, overwhelming opponents with pure physical dominance that made tactical complexity unnecessary. But Hana was no longer the confused human who had arrived at the academy 18 months earlier. She had spent over a year learning to read Velthran body language, studying the microscopic tells that preceded their attacks. When Minho charged forward with species-typical confidence, she was already moving to exploit the openings that his arrogance created. She slipped his opening strike with millimeters to spare, using his momentum to throw him off balance in ways that Velthran combat training never addressed. Before he could recover, she was inside his guard, striking at the weak points she had discovered through months of systematic analysis. Pressure points hidden beneath armor plates, joints that could be manipulated if approached from precisely the right angles. The match lasted 43 minutes. Minho, bred for dominance, found himself struggling against an opponent who refused to acknowledge his obvious superiority. His armor began to feel heavy as human persistence forced him into extended combat that his physiology rarely experienced. Sweat gathered beneath his natural plating, creating stress patterns that interfered with his movement. When his final strike missed by the narrowest possible margin, leaving him overextended and vulnerable, Hana's counterattack connected with surgical precision. The impact sent him to the arena floor, unconscious before his armored body finished sliding across the combat surface. The arena fell completely silent. In 3 centuries of academy history, no human had ever won a combat trial against a superior species. The diplomatic observers sat frozen in their crystalline seats, their alien minds trying to process what they had just witnessed. The mathematical impossibility had occurred in front of thousands of witnesses, broadcast to military leaders across the galaxy. Hana walked away from the victory with the same steady gait she had maintained through every previous defeat. But now the watching aliens understood they were seeing something unprecedented in galactic military history. A species that had somehow turned losing into an art form so perfect that it had become indistinguishable from winning. The tournament bracket displays flickered as automated systems updated the results. For the first time in Academy records, a human name moved from the bottom tier toward the second round. Around the arena, conversations began in languages that translator systems struggled to process as beings tried to explain the impossible to each other. In the diplomatic observer section, a Velthran admiral leaned forward in his seat, his yellow eyes fixed on the small human who was disappearing into the competitor preparation areas. Beside him, a Krell general clicked his mandibles in patterns that indicated deep mathematical confusion. A Nethiri ambassador flickered between solid and gaseous states, her energy matrix destabilized by what she had witnessed. How did she predict his attack patterns? The Velthran admiral asked in the careful diplomatic language used for interspecies communication. More importantly, replied the Krell general, how did she know about joint vulnerabilities that our own medical databases do not recognize? The Nethiri ambassador solidified enough to speak clearly. She fought like someone who had been studying Velthran anatomy for years, but also like someone who understood Velthran psychology better than Velthrans understand themselves. Down in the preparation areas, other tournament competitors were beginning to realize that their careful strategies for advancing through predictable opposition would need immediate revision. The human had not simply won her first match. She had won it using techniques that suggested detailed knowledge of weaknesses that supposedly did not exist. Hana sat alone in the small chamber assigned to tournament competitors, reviewing data tablets that contained her analysis of upcoming opponents. Her second round match would be against Yuna, a Netheri phaser whose gaseous abilities had never been countered by conventional attacks. The rest of the tournament bracket stretched above her, filled with beings whose natural advantages seemed insurmountable. But insurmountable was a concept that humans had never learned to accept. Every mountain could be climbed if you were willing to take enough steps. Every ocean could be crossed if you refused to turn back when the journey became difficult. Every impossible challenge could be overcome if you studied it long enough to understand that impossible was just another word for unexplored. The tournament continued around her, with other first-round matches proceeding according to expected patterns. Superior beings defeated inferior beings with the casual efficiency that had maintained galactic order for millennia. But in the preparation chambers and diplomatic observer sections, conversations were focusing on a single question that no one had ever needed to ask before. What happened when the natural order of the galaxy met a species that had never learned to accept its place in that order? The Academy's historical archives would record that evening as the moment when 3 centuries of established military doctrine began to crumble, not because of new technology or revolutionary tactics, but because of one small human who had discovered that the galaxy's apex predators had never learned to fight opponents who studied defeat as carefully as others studied victory. Tomorrow would bring the second round, where Hana would face opponents who no longer assumed she was harmless. But tonight, she walked through the academy corridors carrying the knowledge that 18 months of systematic losing had taught her exactly how to win. The second round of the tournament drew larger audiences than any academy competition in living memory. Word of the humans' impossible victory had spread through diplomatic channels to every major world in the galaxy. Military leaders who had never bothered to attend student competitions were now requesting private viewing chambers to witness what their analysts were calling a fundamental challenge to established galactic order. Hana's opponent was Yuna, an Netheri phaser whose gaseous abilities had made her undefeated throughout her academy career. The alien fighter entered the arena with calculated confidence, her energy matrix optimized for the quick victory that her species' reputation demanded. She had studied recordings of Hana's first match, but like most superior beings, she assumed that defeating a Veltron was simply a matter of exploiting Veltron's specific weaknesses. The fight began with Yuna's traditional opening, phasing through Hana's position to materialize behind her for a devastating rear assault. It was a technique that had ended hundreds of previous matches within seconds, leaving opponents unconscious before they could understand what had happened to them. But Hana had spent 18 months learning to read the energy fluctuations that preceded Netheri materialization. She was already moving when Yuna began to solidify, spinning into a strike that connected with impossible precision. The alien fighter staggered, her gaseous form flickering as shock disrupted her matter control systems. What followed challenged every assumption about how Netheri fought when their primary advantage was neutralized. Yuna, forced to face an opponent who could predict her phasing, found herself trapped in solid form more often than her physiology preferred. Human endurance began to tell as the match extended far beyond normal Netheri attention spans. Hana pressed her advantage with relentless determination, using techniques she had developed specifically for opponents who relied on abilities that seemed to break physical laws. Every time Yuna attempted to phase through an attack, Hana was already positioned where the alien would rematerialize. Every desperate attempt to escape led to another perfectly timed counterattack. The match ended when Yuna, exhausted by extended solid-form combat, attempted a complex phase strike combination that required perfect energy control. Hana's counterattack connected mid-transition, the impact disrupting Yuna's materialization process and sending her into unconsciousness before she could complete the technique. 2 victories. The arena's diplomatic observers began urgent communications with their home governments in languages that translator systems had never been programmed to handle under emergency conditions. Species that had never questioned their place in the galactic hierarchy were suddenly requesting detailed reports about human capabilities and potential military applications. Hana advanced to the quarterfinals, where she would face Taehyun, a gravity manipulator whose species could alter local space-time with concentrated thought. The watching aliens were beginning to realize they were witnessing something that challenged the fundamental assumptions underlying their entire civilization. The quarterfinal match drew audiences from across known space. Beings who had never left their home systems chartered ships to witness what military historians were already calling the most significant combat development since the invention of energy weapons. The arena's crystalline seats filled with representatives from species that had been content to remain minor powers in galactic politics, suddenly interested in how inferior beings might defeat their superiors. Taehyun entered the arena with the supreme confidence of someone whose abilities operated on a level that most beings could not even comprehend. Gravity manipulation was not simply a combat technique but a fundamental force that could reshape reality itself. He could make opponents too heavy to move or too light to maintain contact with surfaces. He could create gravitational fields that pulled attacks away from their intended targets or compressed air into solid barriers. The match began with Taehyun demonstrating the casual superiority that came naturally to reality-manipulating species. He increased local gravity around Hana's position, expecting to pin her to the arena floor with forces that would crush most beings. But she had studied gravitational physics extensively, learning to recognize the energy patterns that preceded such attacks. Hana moved constantly, never remaining in one position long enough for Taehyun to establish stable gravitational fields around her. She had learned that his abilities required precise mental focus and clear lines of sight to his target. By staying mobile and using the arena's environmental features for cover, she forced him to work harder than his species typically needed to for victory. The real breakthrough came when she realized that Taehyun's confidence was making him predictable. Like most superior beings, he relied on overwhelming power rather than tactical sophistication. His gravitational attacks followed patterns that could be anticipated by someone who had studied them carefully enough. More importantly, she discovered that his abilities had physical costs that his species rarely acknowledged. Extended use of gravity manipulation required enormous mental energy, creating fatigue that affected his concentration. The longer the match continued, the less precise his control became. Hana extended the fight deliberately, forcing Taehyun into sustained combat that his physiology was not designed to handle. She dodged gravitational attacks by margins that grew wider as his concentration weakened. She struck at moments when his mental exhaustion created gaps in his defensive capabilities. The match ended when Taehyun, desperately trying to finish the fight before his abilities failed completely, attempted to create a gravitational singularity that would have crushed any normal opponent. But the technique required perfect mental control, and his exhaustion made precision impossible. The unstable field collapsed on itself, the energy backlash knocking him unconscious. 3 victories. The galaxy's military establishment was in chaos as reports flooded in about the human who was systematically defeating beings whose superiority had been considered absolute. Emergency sessions were being called in galactic councils that had not met in emergency status for centuries. Hana walked toward her semi-final match, carrying the accumulated knowledge of 18 months spent learning how the galaxy's apex predators fought when they assumed victory was guaranteed. She had discovered that every species' greatest strength was also their greatest weakness when that strength was challenged by someone who understood it better than they did. Her semi-final opponent was Seo-wan, a Krell whose forearmed precision had made him nearly unbeatable in conventional combat. But conventional combat assumed opponents who followed conventional rules. Hana had learned to fight like someone who had never been told that humans were supposed to lose. The final victory came after a match that lasted over an hour, with Hana using every technique she had developed to challenge Krell mathematical precision. When Seo-wan finally fell, unconscious from exhaustion and confusion, the arena erupted in sounds that no translator could process. The tournament final would pit Hana against Jinwoo, the Krell champion whose perfect record had made him seem invincible. But invincible was another word that humans had never learned to accept as permanent. As she walked toward the championship match, Hana carried with her something more dangerous than any natural advantage evolution had ever produced. She carried the knowledge that losing could be turned into the most sophisticated form of winning, if you were willing to study defeat carefully enough to understand that it was just education by another name. Behind her, the galaxy watched and waited to learn whether the natural order that had governed their civilization for millennia was about to be rewritten by a species that had learned to turn disadvantage into the ultimate weapon. The final match would determine whether humans belonged among the stars as equals, or whether 18 months of systematic learning had simply been an elaborate way to lose one final time. But Hana walked toward that uncertainty with the same steady gait she had maintained since her first day at the academy, carrying the unshakable human conviction that every challenge was just another problem waiting to be solved.